Hi everyone, it's Dr. Antonelli again. Back for topic 8, which is chapter 13 in your text, but this will be part 2. In part 1, we started our discussion of instructional strategies and approaches to instruction with the big ideas, as well as the case study of the Oregon Trail, as well as the two kinds or general approaches to instruction with the connections to the theoretical perspectives. We talked about interdependent relationships and some key elements of planning that teachers do even way before actually instructing in the classroom, with goals and objectives and how to write them and what words are the best for observable behaviors in our objectives. Here's where we left off, where we were talking about another key element of planning, and that is that there are categories of objectives. So when writing objectives for what we want students to be able to know and kind of do after a lesson, what the outcome is to look at three different areas: cognitive domain, affective domain, and the psychomotor domain. When we talk about cognitive, we're talking about the gaining of knowledge or information, and what we might do with that knowledge. Okay, when we talk about the affective domain, we may want to write some objectives about, feelings, thoughts, values, and beliefs that students may have about the ideas and information that they've learned in the cognitive domain. Obviously, this becomes a bit more difficult to see and measure. If you recall, words like appreciate back in our word list of observable behaviors is very difficult and not usually measurable. Okay, and then we have the psychomotor domain, which is a category about physical activity and the performance of certain skills that students may do after learning something. So again, these are three kind of what we call a taxonomy or categories. We will be focusing mainly on the cognitive domain, and we will do that by looking at Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is one of those things that you will see over and over in your coursework when you get to your four-year school. And this particular taxonomy gives a basically leveled kind of levels of learning and how teachers write objectives and what they do with their students for knowledge and applying that knowledge. And each of the levels goes from simple up to basically very complex, higher level critical thinking. So if you look at the first level of knowledge, this is where students are going to just be asked to remember something that they learned, mainly a fact. It could be a definition with a vocab word and a definition, or a principle of some sort that they were asked to know and remember. Comprehension is to actually grasp the meaning of something. Oftentimes we ask students to explain something in their own words, and that becomes part of this comprehension level, asking them to read something and summarize it, identify some new examples, all part of comprehension. Then we get into the next level of application, where they take the information that they learned in this first level of knowledge, and then they apply it to an actual situation. That situation can be something that's familiar to them, or happening, let's say, now at that time. Okay, analysis is breaking some ideas down into smaller, simpler parts, and then kind of seeing how, let's say, part A relates to part B, or is B and C kind of a subcategory under A. Like, that would be how they're organized, and that's all part of this analysis level. Then we have a synthesis level, and another word to remember for synthesis is create or creating. And this is where we take some of these ideas that we learned back in the knowledge level, and we put them together to create or synthesize into something completely new. And that, again, higher level skill. And then the last piece is evaluation, where we kind of make a judgment of something using certain criteria or standards to make that judgment, and we evaluate it. So it's where we're asked to read a passage, let's just say, and evaluate the information that's in it based on certain criteria that we've set up ahead of time, or what we're looking for. Okay, so these are the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, very important to use and remember when writing objectives. sometimes we tend to stay down at the knowledge and comprehension level because they are the easiest to assess, where we can give, let's say, multiple choice tests, we can give matching, we can give fill in the blank. But when we start getting into these upper levels, it becomes a bit more challenging without using a rubric, let's say, to evaluate these for students to measure if they're meeting those objectives, okay? In addition to talking about the objectives, we often would like, besides teacher objectives, for students to identify some of their own objectives. It's really important to do this before a lesson so that students kind of have a focus. And when they set kind of some of their own goals and objectives for what they're learning, it increases their motivation because they feel like it's like a buy-in for them. They feel like they have some sort of stake in their learning now, more than, oh, the teacher has this as the objective, I guess I have to learn it today. Okay, so again, though, the goals and objectives that the students set for themselves really have to kind of be compatible with what the teacher goals and objectives are for the particular lesson, or the long range planning, or it's not going to, you know, kind of mesh together. So they do have to relate, but it's important for motivation. And setting goals and objectives for themselves will encourage students' own self-regulation and their self-determination to actually move forward in their learning because they, you know, see it as something they're interested in and that's important to them. Okay, so good reasons for involving students in creating their own goals and objectives. While planning, teachers need to kind of break a complex task or a topic into smaller pieces. Works best for students. Of course, we need to make sure they logically go in a sequence, those pieces, to build up to the larger concept that we're trying to get at. And then we have to decide how to teach, you know, each one of those pieces before we bring it together. Meaning, do we use a teacher-directed method? Do we use learner-directed? And how do we go about actually breaking the task down? There's something called a task analysis, where we need to really analyze what we're looking to teach, and we break down this task and we say, okay, these are the most important parts, okay? And there's three kinds: a behavioral analysis, a subject matter analysis, and an information processing analysis. So here's a good example to explain each one. If the task we want to teach students is learning how to play the trumpet, okay? The behavioral analysis would be, what specific behaviors does a student need to perform this task of playing the trumpet? And with this, think of the logistics of where the fingers are placed on the valves, how their mouth needs to be shaped to blow correctly into the mouthpiece. Those are the kinds of behaviors we need to teach, for example, when learning to play the trumpet. The actual subject matter analysis comes into play with the music. We have to break it down, like, do students know the notes in order to read music? Are they able to interpret the elements? Are there parts in the music that say we pause and don't play a note here? We hold the note for, 4 seconds or 3 seconds, whatever the beat is. That's all part of the subject matter for this particular example, okay? And then the third piece of the task breakdown is the information processing analysis, which is what cognitive processes, remember back in one of our other topics, we talked about the cognitive processes that are needed. How are students going to encode those notes into their brain to be able to play the trumpet? And then how are they going to, if they encode them properly, retrieve them back out when it's time and they see the note on the paper to know that's the note to play, okay? And then coordinating multiple pieces of information at once, meaning the notes that are in their head that they've retrieved, along with those behaviors of placing the fingers properly on the parts of the trumpet, the way they should be. So again, all of these are things that teachers need to look at ahead of time in their planning, okay? So another element of planning is a step-by-step lesson plan, including 4 parts. We talked about creating goals and objectives. Teachers need to decide what materials they're going to use, what equipment they're going to need, what strategies they're going to use to teach whatever lesson it is they're teaching, and the order in which those strategies will be used, and then what assessment method will be planned. We will be spending more time on assessment when we get to topic 10, which is chapters 14 and 15, I believe. So we're not going to spend too much time on assessment in this particular PowerPoint. Key elements of instruction for teachers. Once we actually plan everything out, the actual physical instruction takes place in a series of steps as well, where we usually review what students have previous learned that may connect to the new lesson. We will state the objective, or often teachers write the objective right on the board so students have a focus of what they're going to be learning. We present any new material, usually in smaller logically sequenced steps so that students can follow, and that's what we had in our planning kind of analyzed. What will these steps be? Then we will have some guided student practice. Think of a math lesson, right? We teach something on the board showing how to, let's say, do long division, and then we have students practice some problems, and the teacher guides them by maybe having a student come up and do a step-by-step for the rest of the class to see, and then we assess after each step that they're doing, have they gotten each step down in the order? Then students will practice on their own. That's independent practice. And then we frequently follow up with reviews. This could be homework that we then review in class the next day. This could be where we follow up, a week later with kind of a quick review quiz or, a review game on things we might have taught, okay? So that's kind of important to remember. For teacher-directed instruction, also known as direct instruction, also known as expository instruction, the first theoretical perspective that relates to it is the behavioral perspective, because we want to maintain a positive classroom environment for learning to occur, where we use positive reinforcement, not negative consequences, which aren't that effective. And students will move from, a structured way of the teacher showing them how to do things to more guided, to more independent. And they could use some technology like drill and practice programs or multimedia in lessons. These kinds of actions really reflect the behavioral theoretical perspective, and they often are used in a teacher-directed lesson. These lessons work best for urban middle schoolers in specifically math and reading. We've seen higher achievement levels when using teacher-directed behavioral perspective lessons, and for English language learners as well. This particular method works the best, this particular teacher-directed behavioral perspective. And then we also have teacher-directed cognitive perspective, where we use constructivist theory, where teachers set up the scenario, and students will still work through the information using teacher-guided direction, using the ZPD, the Zone of Professional Development from Vygotsky, if you recall, scaffolding, where the teacher guides the discussion through a question and answer period to get students to the next level, and in problem solving to kind of take students step by step through something. These are all ways that we, teach for meaningful learning, so students see what they're doing is important. And then we use various assessment types to kind of see if students really understand what they've been doing, okay? Technology can also be used to support student learning in this cognitive theoretical perspective. We can have multimedia encyclopedias for students to look up information. There can be interactive databases for them to find some new facts and information. There are lots of tutorial and simulation programs that are specifically mentioned in your text when you go and read chapter 13. And all of these things will help to support student learning in the cognitive perspective, with the teacher kind of directing the instruction, okay? So from both cognitive and behavioral perspectives, teacher-directed kind of goes the best with them, as we mentioned earlier. Okay, so now that we've covered a few more pieces of this topic, which is part 2, I will stop here, and I will then record for you part 3, which is the rest of the PowerPoint. Okay, see you back for part 3.